Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. And this is Generation Jihad, the podcast that discusses what used to be known as the War on Terror and what we call the Long War, and we delve into other areas as well. Today, I have the pleasure to be joined by my friends and colleagues, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer. He's a senior vice president for research at FDD, or Foundation for Defense of Democracies, as well as Joe Truzman. He's a research analyst with me at FDD's Long War Journal, and he focuses primarily on Palestinian militant groups and Hezbollah. So, of course, today we're going to talk Israel, Palestinian jihadist groups, Hezbollah, and the recent happenings in Israel and the surrounding region. Gentlemen, welcome to Generation Jihad. Joe, John, thanks for joining me again. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Good to be with you, Bill.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to talk with you guys. So we've had a lot going on in the last several months in Israel, particularly. Now, look, I want to be perfectly clear, and I think Joe and John would agree with me, but we'll hear from them shortly. What we're witnessing, a recent, I would call it an uptick in violence, but really there's been an uptick in violence in and around Israel and the West Bank and Gaza for the past 2 years, almost 2 years now, probably since early to mid 2021. But this does seem to be culminating into what may or may not be what we may call the third intifada. So, Joe, we'll start with the West Bank and Gaza, because this is we've really seen some significant events develop in the West Bank and Gaza. Let's tell us what's happened. Just give us a brief overview of what's happened in the West Bank and Gaza. Obviously, and by the way, folks, Joe has a great tracker on the and it's at FDD's website of the incidents that are occurring in the West Bank and in Gaza. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend taking a look at that. But Joe, give us a brief overview of what's been going on.
Right. Thanks, Bill, for having me on. So what hasn't happened, really? It's been very, how should I put it? I'm very concerned. And the reason is, I'll tell you, there's some key points we know this has been going on. There's been a lot of violence since May 2021, around there, the summer of 2021, especially in the West Bank. And at least in recent weeks, there have been shootings, terrorist attacks against Israelis in the West Bank. 2 of them that happened a couple of weeks ago, and one in Hawara, another one in the Jordan Valley. Last week, for example, there was a shooting in a terrorist attack in Tel Aviv near a cafe on Dizengoff Street, or off Dizengoff Street, which is one of the busiest streets in Tel Aviv. And on Monday, there was a bombing in northern Israel. It happened near the security fence, the West Bank security fence, and that one is super concerning. We can talk more about it later, but I'll say that the IDF suspects in that specific bombing that happened on Monday that Hezbollah is likely involved, which brings in that foreign actors are trying to get themselves into involving themselves in this violence that we've been seeing and the terror attacks in Israel and the West Bank. We can talk a lot more about that later, but right now, from what I've seen and observed which I've been tracking since May 2021, is that things are bad. It's daily attacks, or at least claims of attacks as well, against by Palestinian militant organizations, against IDF troops in the West Bank, as well as shootings against Israelis or targeting settlements. So it's bad, basically. And what I'm concerned about here is that I don't see an end to it. So that's where we're at right now. Things aren't good.
John, give us your take on what's been happening over the last couple of weeks in West Bank and Gaza. And we should delve a little bit more into that has what we believe to be a Hezbollah attack. And I will say one thing. I think when it comes to Palestinian terrorist groups, foreign actors are always involved. It's just that if Hezbollah itself actually planted a bomb, it's just that's an act, if a direct foreign involvement. Whereas, look, Hezbollah, Iran, and other actors or the reality is that the Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and groups like that, I think they'd be a shell of themselves without the support from the foreigners. So there always is an element of foreign support. But I'm sure you wouldn't disagree with me on that, Joe. But yeah, go ahead, John. Tell us, give us your view on what's been going on.
Yeah, look, I think Joe summed up, I think, rather well, kind of the tactical situation. I think, from my perspective, I want to go back to that May 2021 marker where we started tracking this violence. There are a couple of things that I think are worth noting based on what we now understand. First of all, what we learned during that war between Hamas and Israel was that there was something that is now being referred to as a nerve center that was stood up. It could be virtual, it could be physical. We're still not sure. The details are vague. But essentially, it's the Iranian IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, working with Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other groups. And they are coordinating the violence. They are coordinating the smuggling of weapons into the West Bank. They are probing for weaknesses within the Israeli system. They're looking for ways to go on a violent offensive against Israel. And this is, I think, we've been watching. There's been something like 1,300 attacks that Joe has tracked on this map project that he's put together. It's an excellent bit of research. I definitely recommend folks to take a look at it. But, we've seen 1,300 different incidents, and that's just on the Palestinian side. The Israelis are responding in kind. And so we're watching an escalation that certainly appears to be prompted by the Iranians in some shape or form, by Hezbollah in some shape or form, the weapons, and the coordination for sure. So that's one. The other thing that I think is worth noting, tracking back to the end of that conflict from May of 2021, and we've now heard this from Israeli officials, and I have no reason to believe otherwise. In fact, it makes a lot of sense that Hamas undertook a strategic decision that it no longer wanted to fight wars on its own turf in the Gaza Strip. This is incredibly logical, right? I mean, they've been getting shellacked, in one conflict after another. We can look at 4 major conflicts. All it did was to bring destruction upon the Gaza Strip each time. And so there has been a decision made, as we understand it, undertaken by the Hamas leadership with help from Iran, with help from Hezbollah. They want to export the violence to the West Bank. And this is a double whammy for them. You got to understand, not only is it that they're no longer going to absorb a huge amount of destruction on their own turf, and it would allow them to, let's say, build up a bigger stockpile of rockets and things like that. But at the same time, they get to attack the Palestinian Authority, which is their, political opponent. They would like nothing more than to control the West Bank and bring down the PA. And by the way, at the same time, they're also taking shots at Israel. So there's no loss for them, right? This is a win-win-win actually for them. And so it appears that that's what's going on. So now fast forward to where we are today, and it's interesting that it's not just Hamas that we see engaged in this activity. We see groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, also an Iranian proxy group. We see groups like the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which, by the way, is very troubling to me because this is a splinter of the ruling Fatah faction. These are supposed to be the secular guys in all of this, and they're engaging in this violence. And then there's a new group that apparently is drawing fighters from all of these groups. It's called the Lion's Den, and we did not make up this terrible name. They made it up. We can just make fun of it, right? But so you got this Lion's Den group that is now attracting fighters as well. And it all appears to be, at least in my view, a direct result of a strategic decision undertaken in the aftermath of that 2021 conflict. And we're watching the fruits of it. And they are bitter fruits right now for the Israelis. We are, as they say, perhaps on the verge of a third intifada.
Yeah, it's really a very clever. It's interesting to hear. I had not heard that. That was something I suspected, John, about Hamas operating now. Like that seemed to be very clear, expanding its reach into the West Bank. And look, it's learned after as you noted, decades of destruction being rained upon the Gaza Strip, It's just deciding, well, let's not shit where we eat and let's do it where our main political rival does. It really is a very crafty, a very skilled strategy. You mentioned that new group.
But by the way, Bill, sorry to interrupt, but I'll just say they're taking a page out of the Israeli playbook. I mean, that's kind of the irony of all of this, right? I mean, Israel's defense strategy is predicated on the idea that they never want to fight another war on home turf. And so Hamas is to some extent learning from the Israelis. It's smart, it's logical, it's self-preservation at the end of the day. And it's definitely going to complicate things for the Israelis.
Yeah, it makes it difficult for the Israelis to strike in Gaza without, like, it takes away in many ways a justification for the Israelis to go after Hamas leadership. They've gained that plausible element of plausible deniability. They could say, it's not us. It's happening in the West Bank. Hamas exists in Gaza. I mean, if I was them, that would be my response. So I think I concur with you in many ways. It's clever on so many levels. What's the name of that new group again, John? That that's taking
the Lion's Den.
It reminds me. I'm going to show my age here, but probably the best movie ever. You'll all laugh at me for this, but it's Die Hard. And there's a scene when the best villain ever, Hans Gruber, talks about, he's talking to the FBI investigator or the negotiators, and he's talking about all these groups he wants released. And one of them is, he says he wants 20 members of the Asian Dawn, and his henchman turns to him with a puzzled look on his face and says, Asian Dawn? And Gruber turns around, he says, I read about him in Time magazine. That's what the Lion's Den, for some reason.
You know what? Actually, I was thinking about a different movie, but it's funny that this is where our minds go to. But I was thinking about the Schwarzenegger movie, True Lies.
Yes,
Crimson Jihad.
Crimson Jihad. That's another classic. Yeah. Listen, the 80s and the early 90s action movies, folks. We could do a podcast on that alone. Some of the best stuff. That's perfect. But that gets to a point I wanted to discuss. This is clearly, I know you guys agree. We had a conversation about this offline. This is clearly a front group. And I've seen this numerous times in multiple theaters. One of my favorites is a group, and it goes, but maybe it was a group called the Asian Tigers in Pakistan. It was just Pakistani jihadists who needed plausible deniability to whack some inter-service intelligence agents that were no longer on board with its jihadist project. And they started conducting some attacks. And but again, I've seen this in Ansar Dine in Mali, and all these groups that throughout the Middle East. And I think Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are taking a page out of that, getting themselves a little plausible deniability on some of these attacks. It's really smart strategy in my opinion.
It is, and maybe Joe can talk a little bit more about this, but the group itself, it's interesting because they're well funded, they're well organized, they appear to actually have some training. We've heard at least that there's some indication of funding coming from Iran, but also via Turkey, which is an interesting wrinkle in all of this. I mean, Bill, you and I have talked a lot about Turkey in the past and its support for a range of bad actors. Whether that support is direct or not, we just don't know. But what's just interesting is that in many ways, this does appear to be organic, right? That you've got fighters that maybe are tired of all these other groups that have failed to deliver in the past. And perhaps there's limitations on these groups because of their patrons. And so there is this new group. And yes, it appears to be well organized and well funded, but it also does have a sort of organic feel to it, which, I'll say that is what kind of worries me when we try to figure out, is this a third intifada? Is it not a third intifada? When you start to see things that feel organic and new groups are sprouting up left and right. And we are seeing new groups, right? It's not just the Lion's Den. There's a bunch of other battalions that have emerged within the West Bank that we've never heard of before. A lot of this is leaderless. I was talking with Joe about this recently. We don't necessarily even know who all the leaders are of these various factions running around in the West Bank. And that's what concerns me right now, this kind of the kind of growing chaos, or as they say in Arabic, fauda.
I'm going to, again, there's a lot we don't know here, but I'm going back to well over a decade. To me, groups like this don't exist in anywhere, frankly, where I look at Iraq, where all these Shia groups that never existed before started claiming attacks against the US. We really know they were part of like Iraqi group known as Hezbollah brigades and all these other designated terrorist groups. I recall back in the early 2010s, there was Al-Qaeda linked groups that were popping up in Gaza, and Hamas snuffed them out really quickly. I don't think groups like Hamas, Palestinian, this is just my opinion, I don't think they suffer these groups if they're real competition. This is why I suspect they're more of plausible deniability or front groups. I could be very wrong about this, but that's my read on the situation. Joe, I'm curious what you think, about that.
Oh, yeah, you're totally right. They're, I mean, as John said, they're front groups. I mean, for instance, Hamas in Gaza, they do their rallies and, armed men walking around and stuff, And I've seen plenty of evidence or, video and photos of Hamas, members of Hamas, or what they usually call, they refer to themselves as well as Al-Qassam brigades, but they're all just Hamas. That they're wearing Lion's Den patches and carrying Lion's Den flags and things like that. It's become clear that Hamas has a huge interest in the Lion's Den. And from people that I've spoken to that are familiar with the subject, Hamas is supporting them. Absolutely. And not only in the media, but financially as well. I think John mentioned earlier, this organization is just made up of different militants from different backgrounds, from different groups: Islamic Jihad, Hamas, PFLP, DFLP, and it's very interesting in the way they formed. They were established. They were established in, I'd say, I first noticed them in late August last year, and right away I could tell this was something different. They were all well armed. They were organized. It wasn't something that I'd seen with other Palestinian groups, nascent Palestinian organizations. So something, you could tell right away something was off with them. And the Israelis, the security services, really hurt them in, I'd say, last October, they eliminated key members of of the Lion's Den leadership. But this group is resilient. They're back now. They're claiming attacks, and it's distressing. And also, they control a huge, or rather, they're very popular in the Palestinian territories and in the Arab world in general. Super popular. So that's so it's almost like a movement, and it's difficult to defeat a movement. So I don't know how this is gonna end up with the Lion's Den as well. And there's other organizations as well that I'm seeing, especially Gaza-based organizations that are usually not active in the West Bank, that are saying they are now. And there's some evidence, but nothing yet to really tell me that, oh, these guys are definitely in there or definitely active in the West Bank. So I think there's some propaganda as well playing in here. So it's, but yes, bottom line, Lion's Den is back. They're very strong. They're very active in the West Bank, and other groups as well are trying to establish a foothold in the West Bank.
John, you have anything to add to that?
No, look, we're watching new groups. New groups emerged in the last Intifada, or not the last one. Well, actually, in the last one, we saw groups like the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade emerge and become major players. In the first Intifada from '87, we saw the emergence of a group called Hamas. Right? Whenever you see new groups emerge in this way, I think it's a warning sign. Right? Historically, we can learn from this. Whether it means that we're now in the middle of a third Intifada, I don't know. What I can say, though, is that there's a lot of talk right now that with Ramadan on the horizon, that's the thing to watch. And on that, maybe if you don't mind, I'd like to explore that for a minute, because I think it actually points to a really ridiculous and troubling trend in the way that analysis is produced right now on this issue. Now, we know that in the past couple of years, that Ramadan has brought with it various rounds of violence. There was the Great March of Return that we saw where people were attacking the border fence in 2018 in Gaza, and that was kind of a Ramadan-related event. Certainly in the lead up to the 2021 war with Hamas, there was a lot of tension surrounding Ramadan at the time. Israel's limitations on who could and couldn't pray up on the Temple Mount, Israel responding to violence, whether it was rock throwing or firing off of fireworks. Israel responded and the escalations happened from there. Last year, Ramadan was another moment of tension. And so now we've gotten to the point where, you've got governments warning that Ramadan will bring violence with it. Let me just stop for a second and point out, maybe it should be obvious to everyone listening here, but for 20 years, we've been having these debates in the West and around the world about whether Islam is a religion of peace or is it a religion of violence. Now, look, I will tell you, I don't think that there's anything inherently violent within the Islamic faith, right? It's all about interpretation. But the idea that the government of the United States would be warning that Ramadan is a time of violence, or that the government of Jordan would be spouting this stuff and warning that Ramadan is going to be inherently a dangerous time in the region. This is the wrong approach. We should not be accepting this. We should not be allowing this to happen at face value. And I don't understand the thinking that goes into this, that we would lend credence to the idea that Ramadan would bring with it that kind of violence. Now, this is the exploitation of a religious holiday by groups like Hamas. And by the way, we see it from the likes of Iran, right? They've created the Al-Quds Day, which is the last Friday of every Ramadan, where they're literally trying to push people out on the streets to confront the Israeli government and to delegitimize Israel and call for its destruction, okay? So in other words, this has been exploited for a while now. And Bill, I'm sure you can, think of your own examples of this, where we saw surges of violence by insurgents in Iraq or the Taliban or other groups in Afghanistan, right? People have been doing this for a long time, but this is the first time where I've seen governments, the United States government, again, Jordan, coming out and saying, well, Ramadan brings with it violence. This is insane to me. And it seems like it's just only encouraging these various groups to up the ante as it relates to attacks against Israel in what we expect in another week.
Yeah, John, I'm really glad you brought this up. I mean, this is, to me, I've always said there's two main failures that we in the West have had in the war. And one is explaining the nature of the threat when it comes to jihadist violence, whether it be in Israel or against Al-Qaeda, against the violence inspired by Islamic State, and explaining that threat and understanding it, and then continuing to tell this to the American public, to the Western public. That's why we lost the war. We tired because a president wasn't really willing to stand up there and talk about it. But more importantly, we just failed to fight the ideological war. And what you're explaining here is actually giving in to the narrative of our enemies. And that is just such a huge, we legitimize, the U.S. government, as you noted, legitimize the idea that Ramadan is a violent holiday, and that just isn't the case. And you're absolutely correct, John. The Taliban especially exploited this. The Ramadan holiday it would stand down, and then as soon as it was over, you would see a spike in violence, and it would attribute its attacks to, a celebration for Ramadan. Al-Qaeda's done this. The Islamic State has done this. And again, it's perpetuated this notion that Islam is a violent religion. Certainly there's a debate, within every religion, of areas of text, but it certainly isn't to our advantage to make things up about religion, to say that Ramadan is a violent holiday. Does nothing to help us maintain support for this war, or to or maintain allies that are Muslims who might balk at the idea that the United States is saying one of their most holiest holidays is a violent holiday.
Yeah, and I'll just put a finer point on that. And, 100% right. What's interesting is that we also see coming out of the United States right now statements about how the overlap of Ramadan, Easter, and Passover is a recipe for disaster. I mean, tell me the last time somebody carried out an Easter attack, right? Or a Passover. This is not logical, okay, to be able to argue right now that the confluence of these holidays is a problem. Then break it down from there and look at, Ramadan itself. This is supposed to be a time of fasting, of introspection, of family. There's nothing inherently violent about this holiday. And yet this is the narrative that we've arrived at. And what really actually bothers me, I mean, it bothers me that Jordan is out there, sort of lending credence to this. But then there's countries, where I think we would expect the leadership to stand up and to contest this, right? Whether it's Saudi Arabia or the UAE, or maybe, some of the other Abraham Accords countries, the countries that have normalized with Israel, or forgetting even normalization. Maybe this has nothing to do with Israel.
Yeah,
fact,
I concur with that, John.
Right?
It's a slur on Islam itself, you would
exactly.
think.
So maybe this is the time where Muslims need to stand up. I mean, this is just me, riffing here, but seems to me like this is a time for Muslim governments and multilateral organizations to come out and say, Hamas, this is not an excuse for violence. In fact, I think it is counterproductive to be engaging in this kind of violence right now. And by the way, I'll just note, it's really interesting. There was a fatwa that came out of an Islamic council in Iraq just this week, where a number of Islamic clerics declared Hamas to be anti-Islamic. Now, they didn't tie this to the kind of expected Ramadan campaign, but I would argue that this is a role for them to play right now, is to condemn violence should it really begin to surge during Ramadan, to condemn this as something that is anti-Islamic. This is the kind of thing that you would hope to see that might finally, end this ridiculous conversation that we've been having about whether an entire religion is violent or not violent. It's a ridiculous thing to talk about. We need to point out those that are exploiting this for their own ends.
Yeah, I could not agree with you anymore, John. That's well said. So let's move on. The current political crisis in Israel. How is this affecting events on the ground in the West Bank, particularly, and in Gaza as well?
I'll start. I'm sure Joe's got some thoughts too. Look, I would say that there are indications that reservists don't want to report for duty, and there have been some indications of people vowing to not show up for service. From what I can tell so far, that this isn't posing a significant challenge to the IDF. But it's early days, right? I mean, the protests continue to mount. The tension is growing. You had Israel's president the other day warn of a possible civil war, which is just crazy to hear about.
Yeah,
and you definitely get a sense that groups like Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, right, they want to exploit this, and that's been my concern throughout this. I think, look, it's well within the bounds of democratic societies to debate the role of the judiciary and how it's appointed, and right, all these things, right, they're well within bounds. How the government is pursuing this and how the opposition is pushing back on it. You know what? Let's leave that aside for a minute, because I think that's probably not the reason why we're here today talking. What I would say, though, is the timing of this troubles me. Right? You got Iran knocking on the nuclear doorstep. You got Hezbollah potentially involved in an attack, which I'm sure we'll talk about, in Israel's north. You got a West Bank that seems like it's on a knife's edge, with Hamas looking to exploit the holy month of Ramadan, right? It seems like a witch's brew, a pretty nasty cocktail right now of security threats. Is this really the time that you want to have tens of thousands of people out in the streets where they're protesting against their own? Seems to me like this is bad timing at minimum. That's my take.
I'm mixed on that. I certainly don't want to suppress protest, not suppress, but discourage protests because there's a foreign threat. But what does bother me more so is, threats of reservists refusing call ups, things of that nature. That's where it becomes overtly, it exceeded the bounds of, to me, acceptable political protest there. You have a very real threat. Joe, your thoughts on the developments with and to be clear, folks, we're obviously talking about the election of Benjamin Netanyahu and, the opposition from the left to his retaking control of the Israeli government. But Joe, go ahead. Your thoughts. I'm sure you have a better understanding of how Hamas and other groups are reacting to this and exploiting to this.
Right. So John said it correctly. I completely agree with him. But I think, or adding to that, is that it wouldn't surprise me if Hamas is seeing Hamas and others, Hezbollah, for example, as well. They're noticing they sense a weakness in the Israeli government just because of the current political instability and the violence that's been going on for almost like a year and a half now. So it wouldn't surprise me if they're taking advantage of this. For example, Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's Secretary General, he even mentioned it in a recent speech, what was happening in Israel with the political instability. So there's Israel's enemies have taken notice, and doesn't surprise me at all that things are getting bad, especially in recent weeks, especially with this Hezbollah bombing or suspected Hezbollah bombing. And we could get a little more into that after if you'd like, but it's I completely believe that these organizations, again, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and others, and Hezbollah, even Iran, are exploiting what's happening in Israel. Wouldn't surprise me at all.
Thank you, Joe. And yeah, so this violence that we're seeing now, the media has essentially characterized this as a reaction to a right-wing government, the Netanyahu government coming to power. This, as we've noted multiple times on this podcast, this clearly isn't the case. It started in May of 2021. Why is the media latching onto this narrative that this violence is a reaction to a Netanyahu government coming into power? And again, this really does play into the hands of Hamas and Hezbollah and other groups, Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other groups as well. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. And Joe and I wrote a piece for the Washington Examiner, and I guess it was about 2 weeks now. What we noted is how lazy this narrative is, that somehow that all of what we're seeing in the West Bank is a reaction to the new government of Netanyahu. And that now, look, there are those who are saying that they are responding to Netanyahu's government, but what they're doing is they're adding to a trend. They're not starting a trend, right? Maybe there's an uptick in violence. Maybe there isn't. I mean, the point is that if you've been tracking this now for a year and a half, and you can say definitively that this tracks back to the end of the 2021 war, can we say that Netanyahu's government is driving this? 100% not. And I think that's lazy journalism. It may be new to them because they weren't tracking this in a granular way, the way that Joe Truzman has, for example, right? Yes. He's been watching this now for the better part of 2 years, and he can point to these trends. Got journalists now who are just saying, well, this is new to me, so therefore, hey, let's convey that in the headlines. And look, it's no secret that there are a lot of reporters that airdrop themselves into this conflict, and they pick up right where they want to, not where things actually started. So it's unfortunate that that's what's happening. It's adding additional pressure, I think, to the situation that we see in Israel, right? Look, at a certain point, though, the narrative can potentially take on a life of its own, right? Where, you will see more and more people exploiting the current chaos and trying to wield the chaos in Israel for their own ends. And so there is kind of a danger of a self-fulfilling prophecy that comes with this narrative. But it is, I think, really silly right now for anyone to believe that this is new or driven by anything other than Hamas's strategic decision undertaken after 2021 with Iranian help, with Hezbollah help. And again, this recent attack that we saw purportedly out of Lebanon, potentially with the help of Hezbollah, would, I think, point to that broader picture, right? that you've got a range of actors who are looking to poke and prod and identify Israeli weaknesses and potentially at one point launch a full-throated campaign. That's what we're watching. That's what we're afraid of. But I don't think it's organic. I don't think it stems from Israeli politics. I think this was a strategic decision, which is, I think in a long line of strategic decisions undertaken by what we would call the axis of Iran, right? All of these actors have long sought Israel's destruction. They keep throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. This is the latest effort.
Yeah, John, and you had said something, the reporters parachuting in. If I had a dime for every time I read that the Taliban retired, and I always joke, yeah, they're so tired they took over a country, or Al-Qaeda is resurgent in X, Y, or Z place when they've always been there. It really is. I don't know if this is a result of lazy journalism, click journalism, headline journalism, but it really is not helpful in understanding the nature of these conflicts. It's something that bothers me to no end. It's one of the reasons why we keep the Long War Journal, to try and, our readers and readers of SDD's research understand that these are far more complicated conflicts that don't have simplistic narratives that are, that generate headlines in newspapers and earn clicks and advertising revenue. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and this is Generation Jihad. Today, we're joined by Dr. Jonathan Schanzer. He's the senior vice president for research at FDD, and Joe Truzman. He's a research analyst at FDD's Long War Journal. We're talking, obviously, the recent violence and the continuum of violence in Israel, the Gaza, and the West Bank. John, you had mentioned that a Hezbollah attack, and we had briefly mentioned that earlier. Joe, let's give us a little more detail on that attack. What exactly happened? What are the Israelis saying about this? Why do we think this is Hezbollah? Obviously, who else is operating right on the border in northern Israel and southern Lebanon? Hezbollah, that they basically own that territory. But let's give us some more detail on that, and let's talk a little bit more about the significance of this.
Yeah, it's this is definitely different. So just briefly, on Monday there was an explosion on a highway in northern Israel, and an Israeli driver was injured, severely injured. I don't believe he died. He was severely injured, and the Israeli security forces noticed that the attack or the explosive that was used wasn't something that was commonly seen, especially in the Palestinian arena. Okay. So they knew something was up already. This is something different already. Afterwards, so later on that day, they were able to catch the attacker. They found what the IDF says is a suicide belt, and he was armed. They also said that he infiltrated Israel from Lebanon, adding to the explosive that was used, the nature of the explosive, which is actually, I was looking at pictures of the truck that was hit. It reminded me of and you can talk about this after, Bill, if you want, but it reminded me of attacks against American troops in Iraq, like where the Humvees, it was just like filled with holes, like it was like a penetrating charge, or a directional charge. I don't know a ton about explosives, but the first thing I thought was Iraq for some reason. So anyway, there's a lot more questions than answers, unfortunately, about exactly what happened. So the Israeli defense establishment is only giving us a little bit of information. It's suspected that it's Hezbollah. In my opinion, it probably is. And it's concerning. They're inserting themselves into this conflict now in more than just trafficking guns into the West Bank, right? So right now, I think the Israeli defense establishment is figuring out how to respond. They haven't responded, actually, which is interesting. Prior Hezbollah attacks, they've responded pretty quickly. Same day, they shell southern Lebanon, but not this time. So I'm not sure. There's something else going on there. And I don't rule out the possibility that Palestinian groups are involved in this as well. I don't know to what extent, but it's possible. There were rocket attacks from Lebanon in the last years in 2021, from southern Lebanon, where Palestinian groups were suspected of firing these rockets under the auspices of Hezbollah. So do not rule Palestinian involvement out in this one. So again, lots of questions, not enough answers. Hopefully we'll get some more in the next few days about exactly what happened, because it was very strange because this wasn't just right at the border, this attack. This was pretty deep inside Israel. So how was a purported member of Hezbollah able to infiltrate Israel, I think it was several kilometers at least into Israel, and plant an explosive? It was just it's pretty crazy, to be honest with you. So lots of questions, but that's what we know right now.
Yeah, I've been to that border up in the north. That is one of the most secure locations. John and Joe, I'm sure you've been there as well. That it really does raise a lot of questions about how they were able to execute this. And, look, in my opinion, again, this is just my opinion. As you noted, we don't have a lot of information on this attack. If it is indeed a Palestinian terrorist group that executed this attack, it certainly was done with the support of Hezbollah. Hezbollah knows that border better than anyone. Things just don't happen down there without their support. I could equate it to, unfortunately, a lot of my analogies go back to Afghanistan because it's what I know best, but it would be like saying nothing happens in southeastern Afghanistan without the Haqqani network knowing about it. When the Taliban launched an attack on a CIA base in 2009, Combat Outpost Chapman, and killed multiple CIA operatives with a suicide bomber, it happened in Haqqani territory. You could be damn well, even though it's never been directly publicly linked back to them, you could be damn well sure that the TTP, which executed the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan, executed that attack, did it with the support knowledge of the Haqqani network. And it has to be the same thing here. Any attack coming from the northern border of Israel from Lebanon, I'd be certain that Hezbollah has a hand on that. John, how is this a significant event? If this indeed is Hezbollah, are the Israelis in fear they may be fighting on multiple fronts as they have done in the past? That has been something very difficult for them to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's for sure. Let me just unpack a few things here. I think important to kind of just go over a few things about the attack, but also about the context for all of this. First of all, in recent years, we have seen a growing Hamas presence inside Lebanon. It's led by a guy named Saleh Arori. He actually is the same guy that was responsible for the triple homicide of 3 teens in the West Bank in 2014. That was the thing that set off the war back then. He had been based out of Turkey, and then he was sort of forced out. Now he splits his time between Lebanon and Turkey, and he is believed to be trying to create military infrastructure for Hamas inside Lebanon with assistance from Iran and with assistance from Hezbollah. So we can't rule out that this might have been Hamas actually operating on the border, which is a crazy thing to think about. But there is a possibility of this. It doesn't rule out Hezbollah engagement here, but it could be more complicated than just Hezbollah did this, right? It could be kind of a chain of actors. And again, you got to remember, they all operate under the umbrella of Iran, and that's the way Iran wants this, right? So that's number one. Number two, you got to look at where this attack took place. It's really, really interesting to me. So it took place in the town of Megiddo. Megiddo is just north of the West Bank, just north of Jenin, which is a pocket of chaos right now in the West Bank, right? We've been talking about it, and Joe's been talking about it till he's been blue in the face, that Jenin is an area of instability. It's an area that the Palestinian Authority can't seem to get under control. It's an area where Hamas and the Lion's Den and others have really built up additional infrastructure. But what's also interesting here is that Megiddo is not exactly like a stronghold of Jewish Israel, if you will, right? This is an area where like there are Arab towns surrounding all of this. And it was in fact an Arab who was hit in the attack. And so I'm not sure that this was the preferred locale for the attack that was carried out. It may have been that, it could have been kind of a test drive for, whoever infiltrated, that they basically place it and then they move on and try to stay a step ahead of Israeli security. Maybe they already felt like they were being tracked and they needed to carry this out quickly. But the placement of this, given this is 40 kilometers deep into Israel. There are plenty of other towns that this guy could have, operated out of. Instead, he chooses this area just north of the West Bank where there are not a lot of Israelis. So I got a lot of questions there, and I think the Israelis are probably looking at that too, scratching their heads and wondering exactly what the purpose of this attack was and what was going on. It seems like more of a trial than anything else. I should probably also just note that Megiddo, the name of Megiddo, if you're not familiar with it, okay, there's a mountain, and they actually call it Har Megiddo. Now, if that sounds sort of familiar, it's the word that, or the two words are actually the basis for the word that we have in English of Armageddon.
Armageddon. Yep.
Right? Like, let's not forget this, right? Like, it scares me when that happens, right? Where something happens at Har Megiddo. And that is exactly what I'm worried about, actually. And I'm sure it's what the Israelis are worried about when we talk about the lack of a response so far. They're trying to lock down every detail that they can. Because if they do need to engage with Hezbollah in the north, okay, it is absolutely, as you described, Bill, you've got the potential for a two-front conflict, and the Israelis do not want that. The last time they had anything remotely close to that was probably the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which was a disaster for the Israelis, right? Really left some deep scars in the psyche of the Israeli people. And so, and on top of that, you've got the Hezbollah is known to have precision guided munitions. They're the only terrorist group right now in the world that we know of that has these, thanks to the regime in Iran. These PGMs could potentially strike at strategic targets in Israel, like their nuclear reactor, like chemical plants, right? Other high value infrastructure. So the Israelis have a lot to be fearful of if they have to go toe to toe with Hezbollah. This is all happening right on the eve of Ramadan, as we know, and people have been warning about an escalation there and a possible third intifada. So the Israelis need to be really careful about whether they open up another front. A lot has been said about Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel. What he, I think, is known for after, we watched him rule from 2009 to 2021, right? That was a pretty long sample. People talk about him as being right-wing and reactionary. At the end of the day, the guy's incredibly careful as it relates to entanglements with Israel's enemies, right? This is not a guy that likes to put boots on the ground. He doesn't like to have extended conflict. He knows that this can bog down Israeli politicians and it can be a drag on his own legacy, among other things. So I think he's being very careful for a reason. I think the Israeli security establishment is being judicious as they try to lock down all the facts here. There's a lot on the line that I would continue to watch. But I think, as Joe indicates, there are definitely more questions than answers, with lots of dangers looming.
Yeah. And when you couple, the possibility of a two-front war with the political instability inside Israel right now, that can be the perfect storm, the nightmare for a Netanyahu government and for the country of Israel as well. So I definitely think he, and I concur with you, he's been, the Israelis get accused of being indiscriminate. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is just how reserved they've actually been in their responses to some pretty horrific attacks. And I do agree. I think he's thinking this through. All right, gentlemen, we certainly a lot to discuss with Israel. What are your final thoughts, your predictions as to what's to come this spring and summer and fall? I always hate asking this question of people. It's different. It puts you on the spot, but we're analysts, and that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to try and read the tea leaves, read the future. Joe, I'll start with you.
Right. Yeah. It's very difficult to try to predict what happens in the Middle East, especially Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'll say this, though. I don't see a solution right now, or at least a working solution from both let's say the Palestinian Authority and Israel to try to calm tensions right now. I'm actually seeing a lot of the exact opposite, especially from the Palestinian Authority, where members of the Palestinian Authority or the ruling Fatah party you see them on Palestinian media, hanging out with known terrorists, with terrorist groups, and trying to get support from the Palestinian street. So it's images like that that show me that I don't think, at least on the Palestinian side, at least the Palestinian Authority, isn't willing or it just doesn't want to, or I'm not sure what exactly, but they don't want to end this. And for some reason, they're thinking that way. And so what's concerns me more is that this isn't going to end. This is just going to continue to get worse and worse and worse. And we've been seeing that trend slowly since, again, going back to May 2021, slowly getting worse, worse, and worse. Militant organizations have been establishing themselves in areas in the northern West Bank. They're growing, especially Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They've been almost at the forefront of this conflict over the last year and a half. And the rhetoric, especially the last weeks from Islamic Jihad, senior members of Islamic Jihad and Hamas, is troublesome. They're clearly saying that they want to set the West Bank on fire. That's it, and that's what they're doing. So right now, the outlook is bleak, I'm afraid. I just don't see anything happening. I think positive happening, at least in the short term.
And Joe, I'll ask you pointedly: do you think we're in the third intifada here? Or do you think that's coming? You think that's a likely outcome?
Yeah, I hear this a lot. I see an armed uprising. I characterize this as an armed uprising by Palestinian militant groups. That's how I characterize it right now. I don't see Palestinian civilians in mass going out and fighting or committing attacks against Israeli troops or Israeli citizens, or rather Israelis. I don't see the Palestinian Authority's security services going out in mass to attack Israelis and Israeli troops, something we definitely saw, especially in the second Intifada. So I don't see that yet, but I would characterize this as, again, an armed uprising by Palestinian militant groups in the West Bank that is spilling into Israel as well.
Thank you, Joe. And yeah, you know what? You had noted something about the Palestinian Authority, and I've thought this, and I'm sure you agree. The Palestinian Authority is not part of the solution. It is the problem. There's no credible, quote, authority, unquote, in the West Bank. And that's really the unfortunate situation that's existed there for decades in Israel, is that the Israelis would like nothing more for this conflict to end, but there just doesn't seem to be a credible partner out there in order to make it end, because the incentives are all there for the Palestinian Authority, for Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other groups to just keep this violence going. John, your predictions for the near future, what do you think?
Well, look, I would say that there is a potential pivot moment in all of this. And I think, Joe's right about kind of the bleak outlook right now. But I think a lot of it actually stems from the current leadership, which is, I think, to your point, Bill, the Palestinian Authority is weak. It is sclerotic. It is an internal mess. A lot of that tracks back to Mahmoud Abbas, who is the octogenarian leader of the Palestinian Authority, who's been serving out his 4-year term since 2005.
I love that. That always
right?
cracks me up. It's the longest 4-year term ever.
Yeah. It's like a dog years or something. I don't know. Right. But the thing is that part of the frustration that we're seeing being expressed in the West Bank, and this is by no means an attempt to paper over Palestinian nationalist aspirations and their frustrations with Israel, et cetera. But a lot of this has to do with the fact that there is zero political horizon for the Palestinian people. They've just got no participation in their own governance, let alone what their future would hold as it relates to independence. And a lot of that does track back to Mahmoud Abbas. He is completely corrupt politically, economically, right? This is a guy that does not belong in office any longer. There can be a way out of this. Now, by the way, it also could be a way into a bigger mess, right? There needs to be some kind of succession, right? And when that happens, if it's orderly, if it's planned, if it's structured, then you actually could see a stabilization. If it is a disaster, which unfortunately I think maybe there's a good chance of that as well, well, then we could watch the West Bank sink deeper and deeper into chaos. But there does need to be a change And Mahmoud Abbas does stand at the middle of this crisis. And so that should be, in my view, it should be something that the United States focuses on right now, if the goal is to try to head off this violence. First of all, we should disabuse everyone of this Ramadan narrative, which we've talked about. It's insane. The other thing is, hey, look, we understand that you've got problems, right, with Israel and, questions about your own future. But man, we've got a problem with leadership right now, because your current leadership is unwilling to enforce security in these, no-go zones that have emerged in places like, Jenin and Nablus. And this stuff can't continue. So that's, I would say, kind of broad point number one. And so there is a way out. It could also be a way further into the chaos. But it'll be interesting to see whether the West takes any leadership role in this whatsoever. The last thing I'm just going to say here is that, there are people who are cheering for an intifada, right? We see protests on the campus of University of Michigan. We see Palestinian groups out there saying, this is going to give Israel what it deserves, and it's time to essentially, lay down the olive branch and pick up the sword, and the whole, all that rhetoric. Let me just say this, that if there is a third intifada, which actually would be the fourth uprising, because there was one in the 30s, and then there's one in 87, there's another one in 2000. So this would be the fourth in a long line of violent campaigns, if in fact that's where we're going. But what people need to understand, and this would be the prediction, is that these things end in utter ruin for the Palestinians themselves, right? It tears them apart politically. It tears them apart economically. It exhausts their society. It leads to, thousands of deaths and injuries and incarcerations. Entire young generations don't go to school and engage in violence on the front lines with the Israelis. These are things that the Palestinians simply cannot afford at this point, right? Now, this is not to say that Israel is guaranteed to triumph, but the overwhelming likelihood is that Israel will emerge victorious in such a confrontation, and the Palestinians are very likely to lose. This could be a death knell to the Palestinian nationalist movement if they take things to the extreme. And so it's just something to keep an eye on here. People just think that, okay, well, this is going to hurt Israel, that it's inflicting violence against Israel, and that's their justification for it. I think a lot of proponents of the Palestinian cause need to go back and read their own history, because there are great dangers that lurk right now with a decision of that magnitude.
Joe, John, thank you again for joining us on today's episode of Generation Jihad. I've really enjoyed your insight into this very complicated topic.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure. Let's get you guys back on soon. All right, everyone, thanks again for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive one, if we earned it. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again soon.